It's December 15th, 1944, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Was the most famous band leader in the world today in history in 1944, but that wasn't much help to him when the military aircraft which was supposed to take him from London to Paris was grounded due to bad weather. Desperate to reach France so his band could start entertaining the GIs liberating Europe, he made a fateful decision.
Yeah, and that decision was to go without authorization and hitch a ride on a small plane with a friend and a 22-year-old pilot, flying into quite foul weather and then not emerging from that. He probably crashed, or did he? We'll return to that question later. But his early death resonated with a similar level of shock and grief as, say, the sudden losses of John Lennon or Michael Jackson or Prince. You know, it was not just a tragedy, but also a monumental embarrassment for the US military, because Miller had been the top band leader in the United States for years, and the Army Air Forces band that he'd put together abroad in 1944 may have been the best big band ever assembled. It was staffed with the best musicians in the service, and musical historians now call it a juggernaut entertainment machine, and now its band leader was dead.
Yes, exactly, at the peak of its success. I mean, that's why I think, actually, I'm not sure those comparisons work, even with John Lennon and Prince and Michael Jackson, because all of those guys were past their best when they suddenly died, even though they were taken younger than you'd expect. This is more like when Liam Payne suddenly died in terms of his teenage following. Like, no one saw this coming, but at the same time, it was that plus, because yes, teenage girls loved him because the Glenn Miller band was a massive sensation at the time, but in Miller's case, as you're suggesting, the serving military loved him, the government loved him, housewives loved him, because even before he started committing his services to entertaining the troops, he had these enormous hits. Pennsylvania 6-5000, In the Mood, Chattanooga Choo Choo, Tuxedo Junction, Moonlight Serenade, which he wrote. So this was an absolutely huge star, and the shock of when he died, when it actually reached the fans, wasn't until Christmas Day 1944. So I think you can imagine that more like fans finding out George Michael had died on Christmas Day, if you remember that. There's something extra bittersweet about finding out this pop idol is gone on Christmas Day. So this was a huge story across, I mean, really all of the world, but particularly the United States.
Yeah, and especially because, just to keep overworking the comparisons, I suppose, Glenn Miller enlisting was a little bit like Elvis joining the army in the sense that he was at the height of his fame, and it was a particularly interesting thing in Miller's case because there's no way that he would have been called up. There were a few scandals sort of at the time during World War II about celebrities sort of enlisting in these comparatively plush, safe jobs in order to avoid being drafted. But Miller volunteered, and he was 39 years old. He was a married man, and he wore glasses, so he almost certainly would never have been called up. So he was volunteering to go into the military at a time when he was making $20,000 a week. You know, they'd had 16 number one hits in a 3-year period, 69 tracks in the top 10, and he was voluntarily giving it all away because he wanted to firstly entertain the troops who were serving overseas, and also he had this idea that he would be able to modernize military band music, which actually he did. You know, there were some people who weren't huge fans of the way he would sort of jazz up military standards and then turn jazz standards into marches, but on the whole he did succeed in that, and you know, it made him even more popular. He was the director of bands for the Army Air Force Corps, so not only was he auditioning musicians and then assigning them to various base bands, he also, as we said, had his own band, the Major Glenn Miller Army Air Forces Orchestra, which had its own hit weekly radio show called I Sustain the Wings, which I think is a great name for a radio show.
Well, he actually gave his final broadcast of that radio show on December 12th. He was scheduled to perform a BBC concert on Christmas, and his wife later received letters dated December 13 in which he mentioned that heavy fog had grounded flights. And in a letter to his brother Herb, which was written on December 12th, Miller had actually joked. He said, "Barring a nosedive into the Channel, I'll be in Paris in a few days' time."
You always think that will save you.
I know, yeah. You're always like, look, I'll just tell everyone that there's a possibility of crashing and then I definitely won't crash. But anyway, even as his doomed plane was preparing to take off on what was another overcast day, Don W. Hayes, who was a close friend and band manager, saw him off. And apparently he said, "Happy landings and good luck. I'll see you in Paris tomorrow." And Miller replied, "Thanks, Hainsey. We may need it." And that's kind of the last thing that we know that he definitely said to another person, because then the flight took off at 1:55 p.m. and it never reached its destination. Somewhere en route, the plane had plunged into the English Channel, and neither the aircraft nor its occupants were ever located.
Which we know now, but as I said earlier, most of his fans didn't find out until Christmas Day, but actually his bandmates didn't find out for another 3 days. So it was conventional then, because Glenn Miller was the star, that he'd fly out ahead. In fact, when he first came to Britain to entertain the troops for the BBC on a kind of pan-allied radio service they used to make with the Americans and the Canadians, he arrived first on a plane. His band followed behind on the RMS Queen Elizabeth. So that took them weeks. And actually, in that instance as well, he narrowly avoided death because they were all supposed to meet up in London. He decided, because of London now at this point in June 1944 being bombed by doodlebugs by the Nazis, to escape to Bedford, 50 miles north of London. And the day that he did, a massive bomb landed right by where he and his band would have been staying. But anyway, they were based in Bedfordshire. And on this occasion, he tried to fly out first to go to Paris. The band were following 3 days later. And it wasn't until they arrived in Paris on December the 18th when they suddenly realised, Glenn's not here to meet us. Where is he? And no one had made any record of the fact that he'd got on this plane and left. No one knew where he was, which suddenly triggered a lot of speculation in the military and in the press.
Yeah, I'd say because he was supposed to be flying on a kind of large military transport plane, but because this kept getting grounded and he was getting very anxious now that he wasn't going to be there ahead of the band. So a friend of his, a lieutenant colonel in the Army Air Force, said he was flying to Paris on a smaller plane and invited Miller to join him and come along. And the plane was piloted by Flight Officer John Stuart Morgan. And because Miller didn't seek permission from his superiors, probably because they would have said no, this meant that, it contributed to this initial mystery over his whereabouts. And in fact, another thing that contributed was that the morning after the flight took off, the Battle of the Bulge began. So, to put it mildly, everyone was quite busy. And it was very easy, among all of this chaos, to assume that a person had sort of fallen off the radar was simply caught up in all of this action. And it wasn't until the 23rd of December that Miller's wife, Helen, was informed of his disappearance. And the reason that Miller's family had to be informed is that the public had to be informed, because the Glenn Miller Orchestra were due to play on Christmas Day.
Yeah, you can't really hide the fact he's not there, can you?
Well, I guess you probably could on the radio.
It's the orchestra.
You're right. They used to do ventriloquism on the radio, as we've said many times before. So maybe you could just bring a puppet on and say it's Glenn Miller and you get the same reaction.
Yeah, exactly. So, all this initial sort of the sort of slow rollout of the news did contribute to the idea that this was some sort of mystery, although it was never actually really a mystery. A month later, an Air Force inquiry concluded that the plane had crashed over the channel due to the weather as well as human and mechanical error. But because the remains were never found, the 3 men on board could not be officially declared dead until the traditional year and a day had passed. And by this point, that had sort of entrenched this idea that there was some sort of enigma around it.
Yeah, and I think it was in conjunction with his massive celebrity that let those conspiracy theories flourish. There was an idea that maybe his plane was accidentally hit by bombs that had been jettisoned from Allied aircraft. That was one of the suggestions. He may have been on a secret diplomatic mission of some kind and then been assassinated. That was another one. There was even a rumor that he died while visiting a prostitute in Paris.
Well, I suppose his death also kind of coincided with the end of an era, because after the war, the popularity of big band did start to go into decline. It was displaced by rock and roll and the sort of more intimate styles of ensemble that would give rise to sort of modern pop and rock music. So it kind of almost made it feel like the genre died with Glenn Miller, even though that was a total coincidence. And, and I do think, would he still be the person that we associate with big band music if it wasn't for the tragic and kind of mysterious way that he died? Because if you compare him to...
Yes, he would. No, that's easy, because there's no one in second place. Who are the runners and riders?
In terms of composing and arranging, Duke Ellington was considered the superior musician in that respect, and Benny Goodman and his band were considered more musically accomplished. And even as a total musical dunce, which I am, when you listen to Benny Goodman's band perform, there is an urgency and an energy there that's not in the Glenn Miller Orchestra. And that's not a criticism per se. It was more that Miller was catering to a certain kind of taste that was coming into vogue. As big band it was evolving away from that improvisational jazz into something a bit smoother, which was, the Benny Goodman sort of beboppy type sound. And then Miller was sort of giving you something even smoother, even slicker. I mean, his band was rehearsed to a T. There was not an improvisational note going on.
Yeah, but you're just making my case for me. I mean, what he did is he made it sort of safer and more mainstream for mainstream America to get behind, right? Which is the story that we've tracked so many times before in so many different America genres, from, you know, country, blues, rock and roll, hip hop, where you've got usually black artists initially creating a sort of grassroots movement, in this case, the sort of jazz standards that he then cobbled together and took all those riffs, like you see in The Mood, that was mostly composed by African Americans, but that limited the airplay of a song like that. A white band leader like Glenn Miller was able to sort of magnify that sound to a completely different audience. Incidentally, if you're curious about what it is musically that he did, because I am also a musical dunce, apparently the signature sound of the Glenn Miller Orchestra is to take the clarinet on the melody line and double it by the saxophone section an octave below. That's what he's doing.
I mean, that's obvious.
Yeah. Now you know.
Pair of dunces.
Tomorrow.
We can set fire to things.
Yeah, we can do anything that the previous guy can do, only more terrifying.
Ditch the ads and get a Sunday episode when you join Club Retrospectors. Patreon.com/retrospectors.